As you take your seats, we will be starting. Just before our break, I introduced to you our next speaker, and who's really featured today. Hector Morales, who's a special agent with the FBI San Antonio Division. He's talking to us about preventing targeted violence, which so far this morning we've learned how specific and ongoing violence against churches has been. So please welcome, and he's going to do his presentation right down front, by the way. Hector Morales.
Well, thank you, ladies and gentlemen. Can y'all hear me all right? Well, thank you for being here. It's my honor to be here at the 16th Street Baptist Church presenting on this topic, which is dear to me. It's my hope that at the end of the presentation, I've provided you with some information, equipped you with some information that will help you be part of preventing targeted violence. I like this term, preventing targeted violence. I like the title over mass shootings, because targeted violence is just not isolated to shootings. People can use bombings, as this church knows. People can use vehicles, knives, other implements to harm and murder people. So this is really focused on talking about someone who's determined to target an area, a group of people, and cause them harm. And so hopefully after this presentation, you'll have some information that you'll find useful on how you can be part of helping us prevent the next targeted violence attack. If you have any questions, please raise your hand. I'll do my best to answer your question. If I know the answer, I'll find out the answer for you and somehow get it to you. All right? So without further ado, let's see if this clicker is going to work. Yes, it is. All right. Can y'all see that quote up there? Basically, it says impossible to prevent and impossible to predict. That was a quote by former DHS Secretary Janet Napolitano. By show of hands, how many of y'all agree with that quote? Do y'all think that's a correct quote? How many of y'all disagree? All right. Well, actually, she's partially right. Right? It is impossible to predict when somebody's going to commit a targeted violence attack, mass casualty attack. But it's not impossible to prevent. That's the reason why we're here today. Right? There's something that these individuals do, right? Behaviors, indicators, that if we find out about it soon enough, we have a very good chance of intervening and perhaps mitigating, at least for that time being, a targeted attack that's contemplated by this individual, these individuals. All right? There's a noted threat assessment researcher, Dr. Reed Malloy. He likes to use this comparison, right? If you have a cardiologist, a good cardiologist is not going to tell you you will have a heart attack. They can't predict that. He or she is not able to do that. But what he or she can do is notice risk factors, warning signs, and then talk to you about maybe a plan to prevent you from having a heart attack, right? And that's what we do. That's what we advocate in the FBI. We're looking at risky behaviors, indicators that might indicate that somebody is on a pathway to violence and is thinking about conducting a targeted violence attack. And then we want to get together with a lot of other people, not just law enforcement, but other disciplines, the law, like the U.S. Attorney, community activists, mental health professionals. We want to get together and come up and assess that individual that's come upon our radar and determine, hey, what do we want to do with this individual? Like the U.S. Attorney said earlier, which I'm very happy he said that, we can't incarcerate everybody. Sometimes that's not appropriate. Sometimes what we need to do is provide another avenue of assistance to these individuals. And that's what we advocate in the FBI. All right? I think that we need to have some definitions about the violence we're talking about. There's two types of violence, basically. What you see up there is effective and predatory. I'm talking to you about predatory violence, not effective violence. You get angry, somebody gets angry with somebody, they have an argument, and in the heat of the moment, they pick up something and stab them with it or hit them with it, and they end up causing them a bodily harm or death even. That's not what I'm talking about. But I'm talking about somebody who has a grievance, and they prepare and plan to carry out targeted violence against an individual, a place, what have you. Sometimes they just want to hit one person in that location, and everybody else just happens to be unlucky bystanders that day, right? So that's what we're talking about here, right? But because these individuals decide to prepare and plan, if we become aware of it, if you notice it, you observe it, you report it to authorities, the authorities get together, then we have a good chance of intervening and preventing from that attack coming to fruition, right? Sometimes these individuals, though, we may be able to stop one attack, and I'll talk about personal experience that we have in San Antonio. We may attack them the first time, stop them the first time, but we have to keep watching them because they're on the pathway again to violence, and they're preparing for a second attack, and we have to stop them a second time. These individuals, sadly, back at the Behavioral Analysis Unit, right, back in Virginia, if any of you guys are Criminal Minds fans, right, the profilers, that's the unit I'm talking about back there. They have some of these individuals on their radar for the length of their career, 20, 30 years sometimes, because that individual is a problem. All right? That's a busy slide up there. Bottom line, the key words: consider, plan, and prepare. They consider, they have a plan, they prepare, and that's when we, if we know about it, can intervene and hopefully get them off that pathway of violence through various means. All right? How many times do you turn on the media and you hear maybe individuals on the media saying, hey, it's going to be this type of person, it's always a male, it's always a young person, they were always bullied, that type of stuff? No, right? There is no demographic. That is not helpful, right? Yes, maybe there's a high percentage of these individuals who carry out targeted attacks, maybe male, but that means some are female. And if you just focus on the fact that they might be male, then you're going to miss the female who's thinking about doing something like that. If you think it's just young folks, right, loners to use a term, you'll miss the folks that are not young. They're older, and they're not loners, but they still have this in their mind. So demographics is not useful. What we suggest is that you focus on behaviors of the individual, concerning behaviors. That's what we're looking at. That is much more effective when trying to intercede in a situation like this. Does that make sense? Right? And no profile, there's no one-fits-all profile. All of us in this room alone here, in this sanctuary, are individuals, right? It's the same thing with these individuals who are thinking about doing stuff like this. They're individuals. We have to look at them on a case-by-case basis. All right? When something like this happens, it's understandable. We want to know why. We want to know why. And so a lot of people are out there providing their reasons why they think something happened. Person owned a gun, they had mental health, they were bullied, right? No. These folks have multiple reasons, multiple factors why they do or don't do things, right? I have an individual in San Antonio that we were fortunate enough to stop that had multiple reasons why he did not carry out the attack that he was planning on carrying out. And when I tell you later on what that was, it's silly, but that was his reason. And thank goodness, because it allowed us to intervene. Here's some statistics, just to note, it's a small sample. of active shooters. This happens to be active shooters. And the reason I have those slides up there is just to point out some things, right? The shootings occur in this particular small sample, right? So take that for what it's worth, in 40 out of 50 states, including the District of Columbia. 60% of the incidents in this sample were over before the police arrived. 40% fell into the definition that we have in the federal government of 3 or more murdered victims, 3 or more fatalities, right? And they happen fast, right? See, like in less than 5 minutes, most of the things are done, right? So there's just even variance in this small sample, just 160 incidents of the shooters who carry out the attacks that were studied here. A lot of times when one of these things happen, you always hear there's 2 shooters, right? Usually it turns out to be just one individual. But it's not uncommon. There are instances of multiple shooters, right? So that's why you just can't focus on, oh, it's just always one shooter or what have you. Each case is different. And a lot of these incidents, the shooter stops his crime because they commit suicide, right? And in the businesses, right? You think of business, somebody would come off the street and maybe carry out this attack. Usually it's former or current disgruntled employees who come in and do stuff. But there is one example, someone who just came off the street and carried out the attack, right? So, again, it's variance and resolutions, right? Sometimes a police officer, the shooter themselves, either commit suicide, they stop shooting on their own, like happened up there in recently in Texas. They stop shooting on their own, or they leave. They take off. You know, there are active shooting incidents that have occurred where we don't know who that person is. They got away, and we still don't know who they are. And then you see how some law enforcement gets there, but sometimes, even with law enforcement getting there, the police officers stop it, but it's not always the case that the police officers stop it, right? And then officers, of course, are in a very dangerous situation. We now are taught, you go in. If you're by yourself, you go in to the sound of gunfire, and you try to stop the shooting. You try to stop the killing. But that's at a disadvantage to us because we go in there, we don't know what we're looking for, right? And we go to the sound of gunfire, but that person can be waiting to ambush us, and sadly that happens a lot of times, right? So the purpose of those 3 slides is just to show the variance. Even in a small sample of 160 people, we still can't say these are the things to look out for. Yes, ma'am. The question was, in the instance where the shooter stopped shooting on their own, did they run out of ammo, or did they just give themselves up? Both. Both. We have instances of both. Good question. Yes, sir.
Okay, so you're saying now, students, you're told to go in regardless.
Yes.
Is that because I guess there is another shooting in Florida, the high school, where that security officer or police officer, he caught a lot of heat for not going in here, gunshots, they ran away.
So the question was, the reason why we're asked to go in and go towards the gun on fire, is that because of the police officer in Florida, the deputy actually in Florida, who did not go in, and was in trouble for that? No, that was our SOP before then. It's been since after Columbine, after these active shooting events occur, these mass casualty events occur, we are just receiving training to go towards the gun and gunfire. Before, the idea was just contain the situation, wait for the SWAT team to arrive. Now we don't have that luxury. We have to get in there, right? Now, whether we do or not, that, as Florida shows, right, sometimes that doesn't happen, but for the most part, police officers do go in towards the sound of gunfire, and there's recent examples of that, right? We have that in Dayton, right? The police officers were on scene rather quickly, and they engaged that shooter right away, but the shooter was still able to commit a lot of damage in that short time frame before he was engaged by a police officer. Good question. Any other questions? All right, so this presentation, basically, what we're talking about when we're trying to prevent targeted violence, is really there's 3 stages to it. We have to identify the individual, then we have to come together and assess that individual, and then once we assess that individual and we determine that that person is somebody we need to be worried about, then we got to talk about management. Today, I'm really just going to talk to you about identification and assessment, right? And there are folks here in the field office here, like the AUSA said, and like the SAC, the Special Agent in Charge, said, that you can contact that can help you with the other part about regarding the management. There are resources here in Birmingham on the federal level, at the local level, at the state level, that you can go to when you have a person of concern after you see some of these behaviors and indicators, that you can go to them and ask for their assistance and say, hey, I'm concerned about this person. I just want you to know. And then they should jump into action and start doing what they need to do. All right? So I mentioned this earlier in an earlier slide, right? Pathway to violence. As you can see, there's 6 things there that, and this is just a simple graph, right? It doesn't always go in a straight line. They do this, they do this, they do that. It doesn't always go that way. But this is the general concept, right? Somebody has a grievance, right? They think about what they're going to do about it. Then they do research and planning. They prepare. The breach is obviously they're on the site of where they're going to commit this act, and then they carry out the attack, right? There's this movie called Horrible Bosses. I'm not sure how many of y'all have seen it. But in that movie, there's a scene where one of the actors, he's anticipating getting promoted to vice president over a division of the company. So they have this meeting, and the boss says, I decided to promote myself as vice president of that section, right? And this guy, next thing you see, you see him get up, grab his boss by the tie, drag him through the office, and throw him out the window, high-fiving him and stuff like that, because the guy is a horrible boss. That's the name of the movie, right? And then he snaps to, right? And he's just daydreaming, ideation. That's what we're talking about, all right? I used to joke when I give this presentation back in San Antonio, my boss is here. I'm like, but not me, boss. I've never had that with you, right? But the idea is that usually people stop there at that second stage. They have a grievance, right, legitimate grievance. They think about what they want to do about it, but then they just leave it there. Where we're concerned is the folks that start showing that they're researching, planning, preparing to carry out an attack. That's what we're worried about, okay? So, an example of that, I mentioned that in San Antonio, right? Friday, I'm off, actually. I'm out with my wife and my daughters. We're out shopping, and I get a call from one of the agents in the office that says, hey, we found this journal, and can you send it over to the profilers and see if they can tell us we need to be concerned about this person? And so I said, sure, send it to me. So they email it to me, I read it. I'm like, yes, I'm sending this to BAU because this is a little concerning. Send it to BAU. BAU looks at it, and they're like, you need to find this individual as soon as possible, right? And basically it was a war journal where he was talking about, the writer was talking about how they were going to carry out a mass shooting attack, right? And their reasons for doing it, their grievance, that type of stuff, right? So we jump into gear. Late that evening, we finally locate this individual, right? He was living in town. He had a roommate. We get there. We get consent to search his apartment. He's there. We interview him, and he confesses to, yes, he wanted to carry out a mass attack. And he talked about how he had gone to a local mall and conduct surveillance there, right? So that's what I'm talking about. That's the research part. He went out there and looked at the mall to see where the exits were, what security was there, that type of thing, right? So he confesses to that. The next thing we ask, well, can we have consent to search your room? He's living in an apartment, but he just has one room. So he gives us consent to do that. I go into his room because I'm also back in my division. I'm the senior team leader for my evidence response team. I go in there, me and one of my partners, we go in there, and there's long guns, handguns, body armor, hundreds of rounds of ammunition, more journals, right, in his room, just showing he had all the things that he had. When I asked him, well, when he was asked, not I, when he was asked, why did you not carry out the attack? It's because he was waiting, even though he had hundreds of rounds of ammunition, he's waiting for a specific round that he wanted. to carry out the attack, right? And that's why I said, thank goodness that was the case. So we intervened. We had to do what's called an emergency detention of him. And then from there, there was a lot of other things we had to do. And we were able to mitigate him from carrying out that attack, right? So that's what we're talking about when we say research and planning, right? They're doing reconnaissance, they're doing surveillance, and they're amassing the tools that they need. Yes, sir? All right, so the question is, when we're become aware of somebody, of a person of concern, how can we exploit social media to determine where they're at? Yes, we can look at social media, but we need to make sure that we're still working within the constraints of the U.S. Constitution, right? We do have to respect people's privacy. And a lot of this stuff is constitutionally protected activity, speech, right, for example. So, yes, we can look at social media, and you'll see in a future slide that, yes, we do that. However, we don't always just look at one thing alone, and I'll explain that as well, right? For us, it has to be several factors that tell us something's not right here. Okay, does that answer your question?
Well, hold on 1 second. If you all have a question, please raise your hand, and I'll bring you the mic so that you don't have to keep reiterating.
All right, so if the gentleman told you, no, I'm not going to let you in my room, did you already have a warrant? How does that work now in this type of atmosphere that we live in? Because he has a right to let you have a warrant to go through his house or his car's belongings. But in this type of situation, do y'all have authority through the Patriot Act to go ahead and go forward, or you have to wait to get a warrant?
Okay, so the answer is we have to get a warrant, right? That individual has a right to tell us no, right? Now, what we knew up to that point of this individual, we're not going to be like, okay, we tried, and leave, right? We're not going to do that. We're probably going to stick around, have some surveillance on that individual until we can go talk to our legal partners, our attorneys, and say, this is the concern we have. We asked for consent. He said no. What can we do here? What can we do here, right? So we still need to follow the Constitution, and yes, we back up and we figure out, okay, how do we get in there because we have a concern with this individual, right? So great question, all right? So, again, identification. It's a twofold process. Now, identification is the first stage in these 3 stages, right? You would think it's the easiest. It is not, right? Because there are countless examples of individuals who see somebody with concerning behavior and they don't do the second part of this slide, is report it. There's a number of reasons why they may not do it. It's a family member, and they can't believe that their family member would do something horrible like that, right? And what if they're overreacting? That type of thing, right? So identification is the hardest part of this whole process, where people have the information and they just don't report it. So that's why it's good for us to have stakeholders, multiple stakeholders in the community, at a place of employment, where you make it easy for people to report what they need to report anonymously, right? Even to us in law enforcement. If you come to us and say, I'm worried about my neighbor's acting kind of squirrely, he looks like he's talking erratically, looks like he's massing an arsenal, whatever, you come tell me, I'm not going to just go over there and knock on his door, like, you know what, your neighbor says you're acting kind of squirrely here, right? No, we wouldn't do that. That's not smart. We'd be discreet about it, right? We need to find out, well, why is this person amassing an arsenal, so to use that term, right? There may be benign reasons why somebody does that, right? You're going to see in some of these other slides right here, context, 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 right? In my bio, I'm not sure if anybody's seen it, I have a degree in Christian ministry. So I have a Bible degree. So in Bible study, context, context, context. It's the same with this, right? You have to have context. Why is this person engaging in these behaviors? All right, recognize and report. All right, here's an example, right? There was a teen planned to kill family and bomb his school. What happened is he went to a local storage shed in the community he was at, and it took him 10 minutes to open the storage unit for some reason. And the owner of that storage unit sees that. She goes, well, man, that's... And the person, when this individual finally got in, closed the storage door behind him. So that seemed strange. So she called 911. And when the police arrived, they went ahead and located the implementations that he was going to, all the equipment he wanted to carry out an attack, right? Bombs, primarily, bomb-making material primarily. And when he was questioned about it, is when he confessed that, yeah, he was planning on carrying out a mass casualty event at his school, and he also planned to kill family members, right? So that's what we're talking about. We always hear this term, see something, say something, right? And that's kind of vague, but my advice on that is trust your instincts. You have instinct for a reason, right? That's what I tell my daughters. There's this book by an author named Gavin DeBecker, and when I don't agree with everything in this book, he says we have instinct for a reason. You got to trust it. That's what I tell my daughters. That's what I tell y'all. If something tells you something's not right here, report it to the police, because it's our job to investigate. It's our job. We need to figure that out. All right, pre-attack behaviors. All right? The reason why these individuals carry out these attacks vary. They run the gamut. Some of it makes sense, some of it doesn't make sense. Doesn't matter to us. If somebody has a grievance and we see other concerning behaviors, we don't care what they're angry about. We're concerned about the behaviors associated with that grievance and how they plan to deal with it. All right? Some of these individuals, we know we have a problem when they can't see a nonviolent solution to the problem. And back in San Antonio, during the school year, there's an individual who lives in front of a middle school. The parents come pick up their kids, and they block his driveway. And this guy is incensed about it, right? Because he can't get out, and the parents won't move out of the way while they're picking up their kids, right? So he complains about it. And he writes letters to the media, he writes letters to the city leaders, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, right? And he doesn't make explicit threats, he makes veiled threats, but as long as we see that he's still trying to figure out how to handle this through nonviolent means, that's a good thing. The moment that individual stops doing that, right? Because that means they may have decided to take matters into their own hands. And then a lot of these individuals are just preoccupied with carrying out a mass casualty event, just preoccupied with it. And because they're preoccupied with it, they sometimes inadvertently disclose it. It's something they shouldn't say. They put stuff on social media. If they're in school, they do projects which kind of are red flags that they're not in the right place type thing, right? So that's something we look for, pre-attack behaviors. And then revenge. They've been wronged by somebody. Whether it's true or not, if they perceive that they've been wronged by somebody and they want to go ahead and exact revenge on that person, then they're going to go towards that goal. And anybody who's in the way, again, unlucky bystanders. If you guys see this picture up here, who do you think of those two is the one we should be concerned with? The one who's pushing, I heard, and then somebody said the guy was against the locker? Right? Both. Right? That's both. Both of those guys are problematic. They're engaging in activities, interpersonal behaviors that are not good. Right? Folks who bully carry out mass casualty events, and folks who've been bullied carry out mass casualty events. But not all folks who've been bullied do this, right? So that's why we have to look at it on a case-by-case basis. But somebody who's the bully can also cause bodily harm or death, just like the person who's being bullied. So we have to be careful. And the issue basically comes down to this. for some reason, that individual has a hard time coping with stressors of life. You know, exams coming up, they're not doing well at work, they lost somebody recently. They are not able to cope with it like many of us might be able to cope with it. Like many of us have a support system, maybe they don't have it, right? So they have what the slide says, they're a compromised ability to deal with things. And so they think, okay, this is how I'm going to lash out. All right? The key term there, increase isolation, depression, and withdrawal. Right? Increase. Right? I'm not going to ask anybody to raise their hands, but we're married. Some of us have kids. Sometimes we want to get away from them, right? Okay? All right? That does not mean somebody's about to go ahead and do a mass capture event. I'm just saying increased isolation. Sometimes we get depressed. Sometimes we just want to get away just to get our sanity back sometimes. Preoccupation with past attacks or attackers. All right? Key term there, preoccupation. Right? Preoccupation. The guy who I mentioned in San Antonio who gave us consent to interview him, who gave us consent to go into his room. In addition to all the stuff that I mentioned, he also had a book on the Columbine shooters. And when I asked him about it, he was like, I'm just doing research. Okay. All right? So preoccupation, right? I do research on active shooters and mass casualty and stuff like that, but I'm an FBI agent who's interested in this stuff, and so I can give presentations like this, right? That's what I mean by context, 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 right? I have a reason to be looking at this stuff. Some of these individuals don't have a reason to be looking at this stuff. It's their right, but again, you see that in conjunction with other concerning behaviors, that's what we're looking for. That's what we're trying to determine. Escalated interest in obtaining firearms and or explosives, all right? Again, key term, escalated, right? I'm not going to tell you how many guns I have, right? I have a lot, right? But it's part of my job, right? I'm from Texas. A lot of us like guns in Texas. We're proud of owning our weapons in Texas, right? It has to be an escalated interest in obtaining firearms. Now, explosives, that's another thing, right? I don't know if there's an escalated interest in obtaining explosives. I don't know why anybody would need explosives, right? But, again, we just want to take a look at that and find out, well, why is that person interested in explosives? They may be a bomb tech at the local PD, or they may have served overseas as an EOD technician, or they're a special agent bomb tech in the FBI. That may be a reason. This picture, that screenshot, is an actual explosion in Oslo, Norway, right? Some of y'all may remember that there was an explosion in the morning there. Sadly, 8 people were murdered, and then the individual who did that put on a police officer's uniform, got on a ferry, went to an island, and murdered 69 other individuals, right? So, why do you think that individual used explosives? I think somebody said diversion. Diversion, right? Right, diversion. Basically, they're trying to divert attention. They're trying to get resources to go a certain place, and then they can go ahead and do what they want to do. Right? That may be one reason why they want to do it. They may want to slow law enforcement's response. That's something we do need to be cognizant of when we go to a scene, right? So they may be trying to slow us down. Escalated interest in tactical gear, clothing, or paraphernalia. This individual who I talked about, I said had body armor and a mask and stuff like that, right? So he may have had a good reason to have body armor and this commando type stuff, right? He may have had a good reason. But in conjunction or coupled with all the other things that he was exhibiting, that was not a good reason. He was thinking about carrying out mass attack, right? He didn't have a good reason, a benign reason to have this interest in tactical gear. So when I went in there, there's going to be a slide down the road here. One of the things I noticed is this sparse room. That he was sleeping on what we used to get in the Marines. For those of you who are my fellow Marines here, the little poncho. We laid down on the poncho when we were out in the field. That's all he had for furniture in his hotel room or his apartment room. But he did have this little portable DVD player. And when I turn on the portable DVD player, a movie comes on called Rampage. And it's a movie about an active shooter event where the individual, the perpetrator of the active shooting event in this fictional movie is wearing body armor, a mask, a helmet. He happens to use explosives to disable the local police department, and then he goes ahead and carries out a mass shooting while the police are out of pocket in the town, right? So another indicator, another clue, something to be concerned about, that this guy has this move and he's playing it, right? And you'll see another slide about that here later. Evaporating buffers and fading obstacles to violence. Okay, what we're talking about here simply is things that anchor people, right? If somebody is on a pathway to violence and their mind is not in the right place, but they have family members who love them, they're in a relationship, they got a good paying job, those are good things. But when those things start, they start losing those things, and they have a grievance, and they're on a pathway to violence, then we have a concern, right? Because the things that keep them anchored are now falling outside of their lives, and now they may feel uninhibited and go do what they want to do, what they're thinking about doing. Recklessness, right? And no regard for future consequences. So they engage in risky behavior, right, that they normally wouldn't. Because if they think they're going to carry out this attack and die anyway, so why do they care if they drink more, if they spend more than they have, if they get tattoos, that type of stuff, right? Or excessive tattoos, right? I mean, because I have a tattoo, so I'm just saying excessive tattoos, that type of stuff, right? They engage in behavior that normally they normally wouldn't engage in, but because they're thinking of carrying out this attack and they think they're going to be dead soon, they don't care, right? That's something we'll be looking at. Research and planning, I already talked about that, right? Research and planning. That's what our guy did, right? Another thing that he did, this individual worked at a local retail store. And in this retail store, I found a journal, not in the retail store, but in his room, he mentions that he wants to carry out an attack at this retail store that he works. And one of the things that he writes in his story is that he would carry his duffel bag in every day so that people would get used to him carrying in this duffel bag. And then one day, he would bring it in with the long gun, with the ammo, and carry out the attack because nobody would think anything of him bringing in a duffel bag into the retail store, right? That's the planning part. He's thinking this through. I just mentioned the guy in Norway. Okay, he thought, I need to put on, when these bombs go off, I need to put on a police uniform so I can convince the boat to take me to the island so I can carry out my attack, right? And people, initially, they see a guy in uniform, they're not going to think anything of it until he starts, murdering them, right? So planning, that's what we're talking about. Pre-attack research and planning. Dramatic change in appearance or hygiene. And this is true of, you guys may recognize this individual. He was the Aurora, Colorado movie theater shooter, right? He changed his appearance. This is not what he looked like. He changed his appearance just before he went and carried that out. He's got these black contact lenses on. He dyed his hair orange. That's something that we would be looking at, right? If someone comes on our radar and we're looking at their history and we see also a dramatic change, we'd be wondering what's that about? We should be wondering about that. All right. Now, when these individuals carry out these attacks, how many of y'all think that they are under the influence of alcohol or drugs? Just show of hands. All right. How many think that's not the case? Okay? It's not the case, right? In this case, the majority of these individuals, the vast majority, right? Maybe there's one or two exceptions, but I can't think of any off the top of my head. They are so fixated, so preoccupied with carrying out this mass casualty attack, they don't want it impeded by being under the influence of alcohol or drugs. The guy that I'm talking about in San Antonio wrote in his journal, I need to start working out and I need to stop smoking weed so that I can do this thing. right? They don't want anything to cloud what they feel is their experience of carrying out this attack, right? So if you know somebody who's a heavy drinker, who is into drugs, and all of a sudden they stop doing that, okay, what's that about? You know? Think about that. Legacy tokens. Basically, all these individuals did that, all right? They sent something to the media. They left something on their computers. They wrote a manifesto, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. They do this, right? They want people to know that they're responsible for the attack, and they want to provide their reasons for it. Remember, I mentioned I have 2 daughters. My daughters are music majors now, but at the time they were in high school, and so they were at a state competition for their musical instruments. When a mass attack happened in next to USC, Santa Barbara, and the individual who carried out that attack posted a manifesto to the web. I found out about it. I read it, and it was like 150 pages, single line, just explaining his grievance from the moment he had the first, from very early on in his childhood until he carried out this attack, as to what his grievance was and why he decided to do what he did, right? That's what motivates these guys, to leave legacy tokens, right? And I say guys, I mean gals and guys and gals. And not all of them do, right? To my knowledge, the Las Vegas shooter, we don't know why he did that, right? To my knowledge, I'm not aware that we know why he did it. There's nothing out there that we can look to say, this is why this guy did this, right? But a lot of them do. I mentioned this, boundary probing or breach, right? Our guy was talking about, he went and did surveillance at the local mall to see how easy it would be to carry the attack. He wrote in his story about how he would bring in his duffel bag. One of the other things that he did is he brought a gun onto this retail store, onto the property of this retail store. And that, we're talking about how do we stop these guys, what can we do? That's how we were able to get him on ice for a little bit, because that place sold liquor, and it was against the law there in Texas to have a gun on a establishment that sells liquor, right? And that's the way we were able to stop him, because we had no federal charge on him. Another thing on that, that's a good segue. These active shooter events, these mass casualty events, we don't have jurisdiction in about 98% of them, right? Show up at all of them because we've been mandated to, and we would do that anyways, but we've been mandated to, but we don't have jurisdiction. Usually it's a local agency that has jurisdiction, or a state agency, and we just go there to help them. Later on today, I'll be talking to you about Sutherland Springs, and I'll explain that in more detail there as well. Procuring the means for the attack, all right? Like I said, that guy had hundreds of rounds. I mean, this picture could have been from his room. It's not, but it could have been from his room. That's what I saw when I went into his closet, and I see all these rounds up there. But like I said, he said I didn't have the right ammunition to carry out my attack. And it looks like it turned off, but that's okay. I'm gonna bear with me while I go down here real quick. All right, there we go. So now as they get ready to carry out the attack, you already saw the example of the young man that had a storage shed or storage facility to put his stuff. But sometimes these guys just want to get away from everybody. They don't want anybody to talk them out of what they're going to do, right? One of the guys up there was a guy who went into an LA Fitness and murdered 3 women, sadly. And he'd been thinking of carrying out the attack for 2-3 years now. And the previous year, he actually was prepared to do it, but his neighbor came out, a female, and talked to him, and he didn't do it. And he complains about that in his manifesto later on. He said, she was so nice, just couldn't do it. So that's why he wanted to get away from her to go ahead and get ready to prepare to do his attack. All right? So these guys are going to, if you see that, if you see people just isolate themselves, they go somewhere else, they're gone, and you know that they've exhibited some other concerning behaviors, you should be concerned if all of a sudden you can't find them. What's the deal with that? Now, opportunities for identification. Social media, right? Social media is an opportunity for us to see where somebody, right? What are they posting on social media? The guy in San Antonio, again, this guy, one of the pictures on his social media account is with his long gun. He's wearing this mask, white mask with red lines down the eyes, right? That's what he was wearing. He posted that on social media, right? So that, in conjunction with journal, with interviews with coworkers, his roommate, other folks, we take that all into consideration to say, okay, is this guy on a pathway to violence? And that was one more indicator that this guy was thinking about carrying out an attack. Did I hear somebody say that question? Hold on, he's going to bring you the mic, sir.
Do you believe that shooter video games are a contributing factor?
Well, I'm here representing the FBI, so my personal opinion is not really something that I would share. But I would say that there are many people who play violent video games and they don't carry out these attacks. So I'm not persuaded that that's a factor, but I couldn't support that with research or anything like that. Does that answer your question?
Yeah.
Past behaviors, stalking and harassment. A lot of these individuals do engage in stalking or harassment behavior before they go out and do this stuff, right? They're engaged in this behavior. All these three individuals here, or two of these individuals, one is the one that attempted to assassinate President Reagan. The other one is a Virginia Tech shooter. They were stalking people before that when they went out and carried out their mass casualty attack. Right? So that's something that we, in law enforcement, when we're doing a threat assessment, would be looking at to see if there's any evidence of that. Right? This is something that was posted on social media by one of these mass shooters, right? So with that social media, in conjunction with other behaviors, that would be of concern to us. If it was just a one-off, maybe not so much. But with the other things that we know about these individuals, if they're exhibiting some of the other things, this would just be one more item to consider when we're doing our assessment. And then sometimes the folks that are considering this, they will attack a place that they have no association with. This is actually, or very limited association with it. This is a picture of Sandy Hook, sadly, right? And this is how the guy entered the school. Right, he shot out the front windows, right? It was just a desirable target. And these guys take all these things into consideration. You know, is it vulnerable? How easy is it to attack that facility and carry out what we need to carry out, right? So that is why sometimes a person who's thinking this way can go anywhere and carry out an attack, all right? So the next part is assessment. All right? Basically, the things that I shared with you is just for you guys to know that if you see these concerning behaviors, there are professionals out there who can take that information and start assessing whether that person of concern is, in fact, a person of concern, right? And so we just need the public's help to find out this information. And then we can discreetly start doing what we need to do to see if we have an issue. And we don't just look at one thing. It has to be several things that we look at. Not fair that just because somebody may be a gun enthusiast, right, that we have to be thinking that they're going to carry out an attack, right? There may be a reason why they are into guns, right? So we have to look at other things in addition to, hey, the collections of possible weapons of violence, or weapons or some tool of violence to commit an act. Information gathering. This is what we're going to be looking at. We're going to look at police records, military records, right? We're going to try through the legal process to get medical and mental health records, which are protected by privacy laws. Doesn't mean we can't get them, but it just means we have to work at it, right? And there are exceptions too, right, where if we can articulate truthfully that we believe there's an imminent attack coming, then there's exceptions for those professionals in those areas to share that information with us, right? We want to talk to people around them, again. We want to look at their social media. We want to look at their school records, which are also protected, and diary communications, that type of stuff. We do want to get that information so that we can be fair in our assessment of that individual and accurate as best as possible. Now, sometimes we can't get all these things, right? Because again, privacy laws, something is impeding us getting the information. We may not know who their friends are, that type of thing, right? So that is something that we have to consider when we're making our assessments, that we're lacking information, and how does that affect our assessment of that individual. We already talked about that. Now, I mentioned this earlier, enhancers, right? Again, we're looking at that. We're like, what? We have a person of concern. What's going to enhance the likelihood of them going out to carry out an attack? That's what this slide depicts, right? That's what we're looking at. Is there any of that stuff present in this individual's circumstance right now? But then again, we're also looking for mitigators, right? What are they saying? What are they going through at the moment that might mitigate them carrying out a mass casualty attack? We look at that as well. And sometimes we use this to our advantage to try to get them off of that pathway to violence. They're thinking that way, but then we say, well, look, you're thinking about going to college, or you're thinking about marrying this person, that type of thing, right? We want to look for those mitigators as well, so again, we can give an accurate assessment of where we're at with that person. All right, and then these are other things that we're looking at, right? If somebody makes a threat and says, you know what, we're going to hijack an airplane, load on a nuclear weapon, put a nuclear weapon on it, and fly it into the White House. Well, yeah, that's a threat, but, I mean, is that really likely, right? Can that person carry out that, right? That's what we're looking at. That's what we mean by that. Do we see any evidence of them planning, right? With the guy in San Antonio that I mentioned, definitely he was planning. He confessed to it, and we saw that he had all the instruments he needed, right? There was one thing that stopped him from doing it, right? And so, and do they not have respect for boundaries, right? This person was already in trouble for having guns inappropriately, using it inappropriately, that type of stuff. And so this person, that's one of the things we look at, that they don't have a respect for the law, that type of thing, right? They don't have boundaries. And all we're doing is, again, to go back to the beginning of the slide, we can't predict it. All we can say is, this is what we think the likelihood of them carrying out an attack is, right? This is where we think they may be on this spectrum, right? That's all we can do. And then, based on where we think they are, is how we start instituting policies and procedures to try to mitigate that individual, right? Again, like I mentioned to y'all, when I got the information from the War Journal, right, and I sent it over to the folks there at the profilers back in Virginia, they saw that and they knew, hey, we need to find this person, get in front of this person as soon as possible. And then, after we got this person emergency detained, and we're thinking about steps forward, and we're going to have a meeting with all the stakeholders, attorneys, law enforcement, community members, the judge, the courts, all that. You know, I asked, hey, what's the deal with this guy? And it's like, you know, high imminent danger, right? We're saying the next act this been carries out could be a mass casualty attack. And so then we acted accordingly. So we were able to keep that guy on lockdown. We worked with many different agencies. Again, we didn't have a federal charge on that guy. But in the meantime, we started doing our work. We found out about him bringing the gun onto that retailer, the concerns that some of his employers had and fellow employees had, and we were able to charge him with that. And then this individual stayed in jail for quite some time until he pled guilty to that charge. So they pled guilty to the charge. The individual's a felon now. So it should make it harder for this individual to get weapons. But we were keeping tabs on him, and we asked the probation to go ahead and look at him, see what he was doing. The probation officer was doing that, but usually they were always announced visit. So we asked, well, do you mind doing an unannounced visit? Just see, what that's like. And when that happened, we saw the guy was, again, amassing body armor and magazines and stuff like that, and didn't have a weapon, but had these other implements. So that was a violation of his parole, so he was, again, incarcerated. But that's an example of an individual that's probably going to be a lifelong concern for us. And so we can get that person off that pathway of violence, which is what our main goal is. We're trying to get them off that pathway. We're trying to help them with their grievance and trying to get them off that. Sometimes we have to incarcerate, but other times it's just trying to get them the mental health that they need, right? We recently just had an instance right there where a man who also had some racist ideology in his background was incarcerated for thinking about carrying out an attack. But the other thing that we did was to get him some mental health assistance, right? And so that's part of their individual's plan to hopefully get better and get off of that pathway of violence. Yes, ma'am.
How did you guys come across the war journal? How did you come across that?
That's a great question. Sometimes we have a saying in law enforcement that's better to be lucky than good, right? So the story is that an individual was walking in a parking lot and saw this war journal, which happened to contain the guy's passport. Strange. So that individual gave it to his probation officer, who then gave it to a federal protection officer, the guys who protect our federal buildings, right? Who then called an FBI agent, who then called me, right? So it went through that chain. That's how we got it, right? And sure enough, thank goodness it happened that way. There's probably another reason how that came into the possession of the first individual, but we don't know, right? We were more concerned with this guy that was going to carry out the attack. So sometimes we just get lucky. But other times, people are starting to become more and more observant. People, as we hold these presentations and educate the people and tell them, hey, don't be afraid to trust your instincts. Please share this information with law enforcement. We'll be discreet about it, that type of thing. We're starting to get more information from just members of the public about these individuals. And most of the time, we do a good job. We have failed in the past, but the most time, we do a good job. And of course, there's a lot of times where we have stopped a lot of these things, but we're not going around bragging about those, right? The ones that make the news are the ones that are successfully carried out. And not one of these is acceptable, right? That's why we're up here trying to stop this. But we need help from the public, and that's the biggest barrier that we have, is when somebody sees concerning behavior, but they don't share it, they don't report it to appropriate authorities. And sometimes we only find out about it after the fact. Sir.
So I have two questions, if you don't mind. How does the FBI gain access to my medical and mental health records? I mean, how long does that take? Because I know the whole privacy thing, and HIPAA, I believe it's called. Mm-hmm. HIPAA, but I mean, personally, I always be leery of that type of thing because I feel like if the government wants the information, they're going to get it anyway. But, it's just you have to get a warrant for that. It's just, you have to articulate it a certain way to obtain someone's information. So if someone calls you and say, hey, so-and-so, I think he's doing this and this, you got to get a warrant for that as well?
Yeah, we would have to get some kind of legal process to obtain your medical records. So it may be consent, right? At some point, we may not be able to get your mental health records right away, mm-hmm. right? We may have to ask you for permission for that, right? Okay. At some point, but we're going to do a lot of other work before we maybe come to you and ask you for that, right? Okay. Now, there is a law enforcement exception. Like if we believe that you're just about to go do your thing, we can get some information using that law enforcement exception, right? But we have to articulate truthfully that we believe that you're about to go do something, and we need to know now, type thing. right? But there are legal processes that you have to follow, that we have to follow before we can get those. So while we work on that, right, while we have our agents work on it, while we have our lawyers work on that, we'll deal with the information that we do have. That's not going to be a showstopper for us.
All right, the second question, when you catch someone planning, like you go in the room, you find all the ammo and everything else, I mean, you detain him or charge him with what exactly?
Well,
He ain't committed a crime yet.
right. So we can't detain him, right? Like I mentioned already, we can't.
Okay.
Like I mentioned already, this guy in San Antonio who had all those things that you just described, right, and that I described, we couldn't arrest him. For what? We don't have a violation for him, right? So we worked with our local and state partners and asked them, well, what can you guys do, right? And they're like, we can't do anything else except that we're afraid that he's going to carry an So that the best thing the state or local officials can do is do emergency detention, right? I'm not sure what's called here, but basically you put somebody in emergency detention for, I think it's 72 hours. I think is the most you can do. And in that time, we have to find something if we think that there's something that we need to be concerned about. This individual in San Antonio happened. He allowed us to come in. We found all that stuff, was great, but he was emergency detained for a mental health evaluation. Goes to, in this case, the VA, because we knew he was a military member, and they're about to release him that weekend. We arrested him on Friday. They were going to release him, I think, Sunday. And we were like, but did you read the war journal, right, type of thing? And they're like, no. So that's not our concern. We don't think he's a threat to anybody. We're going to release him. So at this point, because he was in the military, we worked with our military partners and asked that they activate him. He was a reservist. So they activated him. They put him on active duty. When they put him on active duty, they took him to another facility. And he was there, and they're about to release him a second time as well. But before they can release him, in Texas, it may be the same here, you have to get a second opinion. Somebody who's objective to look at that individual before releasing them. And that's what happened here. And in the meantime, working with the local police department, we were able to find that charge. And as soon as he was released, they arrested him and put him in jail for that charge. And then from there, we just worked through the process. So
what was the charge?
They charged him, the local police department charged him with carrying a weapon onto a premise that sold alcohol. And that's a misdemeanor in Texas, or that's some type of a violation of law in Texas. So that's what they charged him with. And we were able to get him out of that scenario for the time being. All right? Does that answer your question? What other questions do folks have? Yes, ma'am.
You were able to put him back on active duty? Yes. How were you able to do that?
So the question was, how were they able to put him back on active duty? He was a reservist, reserve Marine, and so we went to the Marine Corps and said, sir, this is the issue we have with this guy. And they said, okay, we'll put him on active duty. And when they put him on active duty, he has to Marines in this case, or any branch, and then they took him to have a mental health evaluation, right? Now, this is after he already confessed that he was going to do this, right? He gave us the confession, but we still don't have a federal charge to charge him with. We had to rely on our local and state partners to do that. And we do that all the time. We work with them because they have tools at their disposal that we don't have. And then we can try to help out with some federal tools, but every situation is different. Any other questions?
Does that lack of federal law to charge them hamper those investigations? Would you like to have those?
So the question is, the lack of federal law, does it hamper our investigation? I don't see it that way as hampering, right? We just have a job to do. We do need to make sure we're being respectful of people's rights, and that's really our motive, is what we want to make sure that we're not unduly infringing on people's rights, right? I think that as long as we can work together, right, the local, state, federal partners, and not only just law enforcement, right? We're talking about mental health professionals, psychologists, psychiatrists, members of the community, right? We don't always want to put people in jail, right? We want to figure out a way to help them, maybe get them off that pathway. So if we all work together, which is what we're talking about here, which is what we're advocating, a threat assessment team composed of law enforcement, members of the community, mental health professionals, politicians, what have you, that we all come together and figure out a solution to that particular person in front of us. So I don't think, and this is just my opinion, I'm not going to speak for the Bureau on that, I'm not too concerned that there's not a federal law out there that allows us to snatch these guys out. Because if we're doing our job correctly, if we're working with our partners, then we can maybe find another solution to it. It's not easy, and it is nerve-wracking, but we need to do that type of stuff. Answer your question? Anybody else?
I have a question over here.
Yes, ma'am.
Hi. Going back to when you said that females don't do a lot of these crimes, can you kind of talk about what percentage are females involved in this? And then I had a question about the shooting at the club in Orlando, I think.
Yes, ma'am.
Was the wife ever charged? I think they charged her, but was she released?
So the two questions. So what percentage of females do this? It's a small percentage. I'm not being coy. It's just a small percentage. And there was a time when there was like 94% were males and 6% were female. But that was based on a small sample study, right? So I just stay away from the actual percentage, just to say it's a small percentage of females. And then I do not know the answer to the wife of the shooter in Orlando. I'm not sure if we charged that person or not. My recollection is no, but you can't don't hold me to that because I may be wrong.
I had a quick question before we get to you. So there was a young lady that was really obsessed with the Columbine shooting and was wanting to either recreate it or redo it. Do you have any information on what they ultimately charged with as well?
I am familiar with that case, but no, I don't have any information. I don't know.
You mentioned earlier that a lot of these kids or a lot of the people that are doing these crimes don't really have the coping skills, coping mechanisms, that they're stressors or things they don't know what to do and cope with. I do a lot of divorces, and I have a lot of children that come through that, especially this generation of kids, are not being taught coping skills. Do you think, and I don't know if there's research behind it or if you have an opinion, could some of the lack of coping skills that parents are just putting kids in front of a TV and not really teaching them how to cope with issues? Kids are using social media or phones to communicate now rather than talking face to face. Could some of this be part of the rise in some of these actions that these teens are taking? Do you expect to see a rise in that? Because a lot of these teenagers do not know how to talk face to face and cope with the stressors of life.
So yes, I understand your question, and I don't know. I don't know if there's going to be a correlation between what these young folks who are not used to having face-to-face conversations, and they're just used to doing the texting and the social media and that type of stuff. I don't know. I think that it would be good if we did go back to showing folks that, hey, talk to each other face-to-face, get out there, don't just be stuck to your screen all the time. But a lot of adults, we do that too now, right? I get my little message from the iPhone telling me, hey, this week you had an 8% increase in your screen time, that type of stuff, right? So we are also culpable of that as well. So yes, I think that the more we can have interpersonal relationships, it would be a better thing. But I don't know that I can say it's going to lead the lack of that now is going to increase to active shooters. I just don't know. But that's a great question. I think it is something that we should be thinking about. So does that somewhat answer your question? All right.
So much of the discussion is about individual mental state. angle, but there's also violence that is emboldened by group mentalities and group thought and group held beliefs. So that relationship between the individual act and organized group hate is also an important connection that you have not truly explored so far. Could you talk about it?
Yes, I understand what you're saying, and the focus of my presentation really was just to be on the individuals who carry this out. There is the group dynamic that you mentioned, but I sadly am not the one to talk about that in this venue. However, I think that if you reach out to the local, FBI office here, they may be able to get you someone who can talk about the group dynamics associated with violence like this. So sadly, I'm not the one to answer it because I'm mostly focused on just these individuals that carry out, or one or two individuals that carry out these mass attacks. So I apologize.
Well, we're going to let that be our last question.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you, folks.
Thank you.
That is FBI Special Agent Hector Morales, the San Antonio Division. Thank you for that. Very, very eye-opening. Big takeaway for those of us in the public who are listening is really that recognizing and reporting is so important. And thank you for giving us some of the things that we could recognize that could be happening right under our noses that we don't really connect those dots on. So thank you so much for that. So listen, it is break time. Lunch time this time. So lunch will be off campus. You can walk a couple of blocks up here to the left to the Alabama Power Building. They have a lot of options for you. There could be some food trucks in the area as well. Lunch on your own. We're back here for the presentation at 1:05, so you want to start making your way back a little earlier than that so that we can get situated. And if you're out walking around, you're going to want to get back in here where it's really cool anyway. So break for lunch and much more in our Hate in Our House conference coming up.